Hello and welcome to the Unit 3 Lesson 2 WeDo. Here we will be transferring paragraphs into timeline information. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take this big long paragraph here and we're going to summarize it into a single timeline event, right? And so usually, we have an article that's really big, full of information, and it gets condensed down into a tiny timeline. So here we have this text right here, and we want to turn it into a smaller bit of information for our timeline. In 1960, Southern states ramped up barriers to voting. The struggle for equal voting rights came to a head in the 1960s as many states, particularly in the South, dug in on policies such as literacy tests, poll taxes, English language requirements, and more aimed at suppressing the vote among people of color, immigrants, and low-income populations. In March 1965, activists organized protest marches from Selma, Alabama, to the state capital Montgomery to spotlight the issue of black voting rights. The first march was brutally attacked by police and others on a day that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. After a second march was cut short, a throng of thousands finally made the journey, arriving in Montgomery on March 24th and drawing nationwide attention to the issue. Okay, so to condense that, I just want to summarize it into one sort of sentence. So first I'm going to put the date 1960, and then I'm going to say something like as Southern states work to bar voters who respond by marching on capitals. Right? Simple. That captures most of what happened in here in a much more simple version, right? Not as complex, not as much information, but for a timeline, that's what we're looking for, right? So here, the Supreme Court strikes a blow to the Voting Rights Act. This is June 2013, right? In its June ruling in the case Shelby County versus Holder, the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Because of the court's decision, and the states and localities with a history of suppressing voting rights no longer were required to submit changes in their election laws to the U.S. Justice Department for review, or pre-clearance. The 5-4 decision ruled unconstitutional a section of the landmark 1965 law that was key to protecting voters in states and localities with a history of race-based voter suppression. In her dissent, that means she disagreed with the decision, in the case, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously stated, "Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet." Alright, so how would you summarize this into a timeline event text? How would you condense it into a small bit of information for a timeline? Okay, so if you wrote something like June 2013, pre-clearance is removed from the Voting Rights Act, right? That is something very simple. You might have also said something like the Supreme Court knocked down pre-clearance from the 1965 Voting Rights Act, or the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to get rid of pre-clearance for the Voting Rights Act. But basically you want to look for the main idea, right? The Voting Rights Act, and then what they did to it, right? And include all of that. Okay, let's try one more together. Alright, text paragraph. 2016, presidential election and claims of fraud. After President Trump was elected, despite losing the popular vote, he and his supporters made claims that large numbers of people voted illegally. A Washington Post analysis was able to find only 4 documented cases of voter fraud in the 2016 election out of 135 million ballots cast. The narrative about fraud ultimately resulted in President Trump convening the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity, which disbanded in January 2018 without presenting any evidence or findings. Continued false claims of rampant voter fraud have added fuel to the fire and prompted even bolder efforts to suppress the vote. Adding to the problems, government at all levels has largely failed to make the necessary investments in elections, from technology to poll worker training, to ensure the integrity and efficiency of the electoral system. Okay, so how would you condense that piece of information? I know that's a lot and it's very complicated, but how would you turn that into a timeline event? Alright, so remember, we're going to start with the date and say that we might say that voter suppression is on the rise due to false claims of voter fraud, right? That gets most of the information in this paragraph into a single one-off sentence, right? Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to put it actually on a timeline. Alright, so we're going to put this on a timeline. So if we go back here, this is really simple. We just find the first date, which is going to be our 1960s date, right? And we're just going to put that into our first box. Okay, we can shrink down that so it fits. And remember, it goes in chronological order. So first event, second event, third event. Now, our second event was in June 2013. So copy that, click in the box, paste, make it smaller so it matches, and I'm going to change the text color so it fits a little bit better. And you'll notice how this is way farther away from this. That's because June 2013 is really far after 1960, right? And then, oh, this one, this is 2016, right? So in 2016, way too big. See how much closer these two events are together on our timeline? That just shows sort of the relationship between those two events. These things happen near each other. These things happen farther away from each other, right? And so that's how we take a sequence text, right, with all of its information, and we turn it into a timeline. We summarize the events, and then we put it onto the actual timeline, and we keep it in chronological order, and we keep events that are close together, and events that are far apart, right? It's a relationship and a reference. So that way we can see that all of this happened way after all of this, right? So there you go. It's now going to be your turn in the You Do section of our lesson for you to build your own timeline. Good luck.